Thank you so much for being here. As Dan introduced me, my name is Burçin Becer-Gerber, and I'm the chair of Civil and Environmental Engineering Department, and also one of the co-designers and co-teachers of a course that is very, very dear to me. I have my colleagues here. Brad, I don't know where he is, right here. And so he's one of the co-instructors of this course, where we focus on innovation in design and engineering for global crises. Riz is one of our alumni. We have many other former students here, along with the new students here. And that's the course, I think, the context that brought me here to you guys today. So Riz, do you want to say a couple words about our course and what we're doing in the course?
Of course, so it is also the context that brought me here today. It definitely was an incredibly instrumental part of my undergraduate degree. As I think was mentioned in the introduction, I'm a recent grad of the biomedical engineering department, so I graduated in May. And I'm still continuing to work on the innovation that I co-founded as a part of the course that Burçin and Brad and other professors who are not here with us tonight founded. What my innovation does, in short, is redesigns the way that refugees receive international aid and makes it kind of a more personal one-to-one connection. This experience, again, I will just state again, it was something I didn't expect to get into as a biomedical engineer, but it was absolutely instrumental and changed my complete direction in life and where I see myself going. So I'm very grateful to be here today and help introduce the amazing panelists that are behind us. To introduce the first person?
Sure. Well, as Riz said, it's our pleasure to introduce our panelists here today. I'm going to start with Roya. Roya Mahboob. She is an Afghan entrepreneur and philanthropist focused on building digital literacy among women and children in developing countries. She is the founder and CEO of Afghan Citadel software company, creating jobs for recent graduates, especially girls, in the new IT markets of Afghanistan. She also founded the Afghan Girls Robotics Team, Afghan Dreamers, the nation's first all-female robotics team. She was named to Time magazine's 100 most influential people in the world for her work in building internet classrooms in high schools in Afghanistan.
Is Luca Buchan, who is a peace-building policy advisor at the intersection of conflict, climate, gender, and health. He was previously a policy and programs director for the Elman Peace Center in Somalia, and he now manages strategic partnerships for Sweetheart, a telehealth provider specializing in crisis zones. Luca is an MPP graduate from Maastricht University and United Nations University, as well as an ambassador at One Young World.
Next, we have Sophia Mahfooz. She is a British-Afghan tech entrepreneur, founder of Afghan Innovation, a startup bringing innovative solutions to humanitarian response, and NeuroX Health, providing personalized, data-driven care for people suffering from mental health disorders. Sophia also served as the CEO of Girls in Tech, one of the largest women in tech organizations in the world.
And lastly, but certainly not least, we have MJ Cantrell. She is a veteran of the war in Afghanistan, and as that, she was also additionally part of the digital effort to assist those who sought to evacuate after Kabul fell, aka Digital Dunkirk. She holds a master's degree in international peace and security from King's College, London, and is currently a PhD student in Arizona State University's political science program. Her primary research interest is misinformation. She's also an Army officer, having been commissioned in 2014. Welcome.
So I'm going to start with Roya. Roya, it's been very difficult weeks and months for Afghanistan. And Can you please walk us through what these last months have been like and how it has affected the communities that you work with, the women you work with?
I have to say that everything started with a text message that I received from my friends. I decided to not check in the social media because after Herat collapse, and we got very upset and we didn't want to follow the news because it was very sad every time we see that one of the district or one of the provinces is collapse. And I decided to for 24 hours not checking the social media. And then I received this text that says your president is kept. I didn't believe it. I went to the Facebook and I saw all of these messages. I'm gonna take you back that we have a team of teenagers that they are called Afghan Dreamers, and they becoming as a symbol of hope and unity in the country, and they got very famous with their works, with their robotics. And we brought them one day before the Herat collapse. So we brought them to Kabul. They were part of a competition, first global competition. We thought that Herat is not safe, so we brought them to Kabul and we tried to get visas for them. For weeks we tried, we couldn't. And then the night that was Kabul supposed to collapse, the night before, we found a generous donor that he decided to buy for them a ticket to Maldives. So we got the tickets for them. And early morning we sent them to get their vaccine, to do their corona test, and we sent them to the airport. They're telling me in the way that the city was empty, that the roads was empty, and they're telling me that they're seeing Taliban in the street. I said, no, probably, I don't think that Taliban came into the city. So they went to the airport, and when the president escaped, the airport chaos happened. People ran there to the airport. And then I found out that we are in a very bad situation because they're all teenagers and we didn't have only my father was with them. My father was older and there are 10 young girls. And people get panic when they went to the airport. So they only hear the Taliban come to the city. And that's make it very difficult because people get very upset. They also sometimes get panicked. And we decided to bring the girls back because the airport was thousands of Afghans running there. And I think that it wasn't a wise idea, but at that time we thought it's more safe because lots of assaulting is happening there, people beating each other, and we thought it's not safe to keep the girls there. We brought the girls back, but it's got very difficult to bring them back to the airport because after that, thousands of Afghans running there. And then we decided to send a message to Qatari governments, which we had a relationship with before with them, and they accepted immediately, and they sent a plane to Afghanistan at the time. And then for 2 days, the girls went to the airport. They couldn't reach to the gates. And then we decided to send to the Suriname, and then the ambassadors, they escort them so the girls could evacuate it. But then I have hundreds of other staff and their family members that they were left, and then we decided to save everybody because the girls was one part of the program, but there are many other people who were involved. We brought them to Kabul, but as you know that many of other people who are involved in evacuation, those days was very sad days, I guess, and it was very overwhelming by messages and the calls that you receive from friends, and everybody knows and they're trying to get out of the country. And the one thing that I found is that U.S. government didn't that much help, but it was private funded Americans who venture capitalists or those people that they decided to help and volunteer people. And with the help of them, of course, many of these evacuation happened, many of these charter plan happened that they could take people out, but then the other issues is happening is that we brought the people out, but they are staying in other countries and they don't know how they can come to the United States because many of them, they don't have the visas or they are not part of the SIV visas of P1 or P2. But anyway, let the others also explain about the evacuation part, but right now, during these 3 months, lots of things that's happening in Afghanistan. So I want to give a little bit information about that. 9 of 10 people in Afghanistan, they don't have access to enough foods today. And we have 1 million already, actually 3 million already affected with young children that they are affected with, malnutrition. And we're going to have winters coming, and it's going to be very hard times for Afghans. And by that time also bank collapse, and you never know how to send the money to the country. So those are all the issues. I think that other colleagues probably going to explain more.
This was a really interesting humanitarian crisis because leading up from the crisis in Syria, we realized that grassroots volunteers who are passionate about being at the forefront of saving people's lives is really powerful and effective. And the crisis in Afghanistan kind of expanded that. It allowed us to see that with, armed with WhatsApp, Signal, Google Sheets, any one of us here could really run entire evacuation operations in Afghanistan. It's absolutely extraordinary because it gives so much power to the individual. And I think there's this misconception that, we look at the media and we think, okay, the UN's going to step in, or America's going to step in and provide relief or aid. And this is the first time where we as a community realize that any one of us could actually be the response. So I think that's really powerful. In terms of Afghan Innovation, it was really born out of the crisis. I was a child refugee and was a refugee for 8 years on the borders of Afghanistan and Pakistan. And so for me, that morning when Kabul got taken over, I woke up and I thought, I was a victim of this crisis almost 30 years ago. I could not wake up and be a witness and go to work. So within 12 hours, we put a team of 30 people together. A lot of my friends who work in tech in San Francisco showed up to my apartment and stayed up until 4 a.m., doing data entry. These are engineers that work at Apple and Google who spent, 24 hours a day just, not really working and focusing on this crisis. We had former State Department officials, former Obama administration officials, and just people from all walks of life, school teachers, nurses, coming together to really help with the evacuation. Afghan Innovation is in a unique position because we are in this really interesting time where the humanitarian aid ecosystem is ripe for disruption. When you look at how technology has disrupted healthcare in the last 2 years, 2 years ago it was really difficult to get even a Zoom appointment with your doctor, and the pandemic really accelerated that. And I think the next 10 years will exponentially increase in terms of the technology that's applied in healthcare. I think the humanitarian aid system is one of the areas that technology hasn't really fully disrupted. And I think there's some early conversations about the potential of technology. I think USC has done an incredible job of bringing students together to really think about, how do we bring in technology for good? How do we use technology that Google uses, but apply it to crisis situations? And I think that that's amazing because right now, we're in a situation where refugees are in camps for an average of 20 years. That's unacceptable. Startups would absolutely fail for incompetence and bad customer service if it was run through a private sector entity. So I think that there's enormous responsibility for there to be a shift. There's enormous desire, like students here who really want to do something about it. And I think it's a matter of time where funding channels change from aid to proactive innovation. And I think that the approach from top down is also shifting, where right now the governments fund the UN, and UN goes and brings in billions of dollars into countries. That's going to start shifting to small grassroots organizations really being at the forefront of supporting the crisis. These are local people who are experts, who can provide legal aid. Our teams have worked with local NGOs in Greece who really understand the nuanced challenges that refugees experience when they enter Greece. So I think that there's a lot that's happening there.
How do you plan to continue innovation, given the challenges that you experience in Afghanistan? What's next?
We found Digital Sun Fund is a non-profit organization which we're trying to empower young women, young children to providing access to opportunities and education. And we have so far building IT centers in the public schools and teaching young girls to learn about how to work with the computer to level of that. They learn about robotics, blockchain, and they also started their own startups. We have 16,000 of the girls to come to our programs. We have more than 100 to start their own incubation, startups. And but in 2017, when we started robotic team, it has changed a lot of things in Afghanistan. So we could change the view of the men on the ability of women in technology, and that was a victory, a hope for nations that for centuries ignored women's ability in science, technology, and many other industries. And that was, we keep it, and then we made a contract with Afghan governments to build the first STEM school in Afghanistan with a focus on AI, robotics, and blockchain, and building 5 other innovation centers across of the country. We signed that contract in December of 2020, and we got some other partners with the University of Yale, which designed a very beautiful campus for us. And we're also talking with Cambridge University to be one of our partners in this. A week before that, couple collapsed. The girls showcase of one of their projects to the Minister of Publics, and finally they could get approval of that robots, which they call sanitizer robots, to start the first factory of robotics, which all girls would run that. And Afghanistan had a lot of the progress during the last 2 decades, which unfortunately many of media failed to show it. And the younger generation of Afghanistan, especially the under 20, they grew up in era of democratic era, that they have access to information, access to democracy, and they have the expectation are much different than, my family or my parents' generation than my generations. I remember the time that I was just come back from, in 2003, when we came back to Afghanistan, I just introduced this magic box people call computer, and I look at now that the girls go to the stages and compete with, with other countries on robotics. So a lot of changes happening in Afghanistan. We are not going to give up on millions of the kids that are going to live there. And that's why during these 3 months, we're working with Qatari governments and with the women and the governments that they support our works to talk with Taliban on our behalf to making sure that our IT centers will be active in the future. I don't know how much it's going to work, but we just not going to stop it, and we're going to have an exhibition in March of 2022. And the idea is that we bring Muslim women from the Muslim nations to start a dialogue with conservative leaders of the Taliban, that what basically Sharia law says is what they say, and what they say is not true. So the idea is that bringing these women technologists, scientists, and engineers, and we're gonna showcase and confront them. And basically also this exhibition gonna rebuild all of the robots and the girls that I've built within the last 5 years. And then we're bringing also the arts and other girls that under 20, they have done amazing things to showcase on this exhibition. But yes, we're going to keep continue, and I don't think that we're going to give up. It might be very difficult at this time when you look at Afghanistan with this leadership, but I think that the contents of Taliban has been changed. The society that they operated in 1990s, it has been changed. And the expectation of the people toward the women's rights and as well the education has been changed. So we have 60% of the population that as I mentioned, they grew up with cell phone and democracy and the freedom of speech. How they can deny this? The people will force them to be changed. Even the Taliban doesn't want, they will be forced to be changed themselves. It might be difficult at the beginning, but I think it's a new fight for us, it's a new chapter, and we will keep continue to making sure. Afghanistan within the next 10 years be the country of the source of high-tech technology rather than a country of terror and war.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much, Roya, for that. I think we have a clip. I'm not sure if we are able to play it.
Known for their innovation and ingenuity, the Afghan Girls Robotics Team has competed around the globe on projects including building a ventilator with car parts.
Our favorite part is about solving the communities and our community problem. And I'm so interested in the future to serve my people and help my people.
They had left Kabul days before it was taken by the Taliban. Speaking from Doha, they say they hope to return.
It's normal that everyone have fear, but I hope that they can continue, and I want it from the new government that let our new generation, let the girls and boys to continue their education.
Although articulate about what they want for the future, as the country transitions and the future's uncertain, it can be overwhelming. The team leader tells me it's untenable to coordinate getting all girls who want an education out of Afghanistan. Instead, she wants to engage with the Taliban and for both sides to build trust.
We have to making sure that our younger generation have access to the tools and guidance to making a better Afghanistan, to become the next scientist, entrepreneur, and technologist. This is what we needed for Afghanistan, and this is what our wish for the Afghanistan.
The Afghan Girls Robotics Team say they hope to continue their education here in Qatar Foundation, but their future is in Afghanistan. They hope that life under Taliban rule is different from the 1990s, and they want to continue to compete around the world.
The Taliban has promised they would respect women's rights within the norms of Islamic law. A spokesman's Twitter page shows girls going back to school. But despite the assurances, some Afghans see the Taliban's gains as dangerous for women. The former captain of the Afghan women's football team, Khalida Popal, herself a refugee, has been helping to get her former team out of Kabul.
Since the fall of Kabul, things have become very hopeless for people there. And especially women and girls are very scared and afraid of their future.
Some fear that progress will be in peril. Others are pinning their hopes on reform and to work towards a positive future for women and girls. Laura Bowden-Manley, Al Jazeera, Doha.
So during the crisis response in July and August, we witnessed this grassroots digital community networks in a moment. When the governments basically failed to respond. So do you think this presents new opportunities for disruptive models for humanitarian response? And what are some of the benefits of this, but what are some of the challenges as well?
Yeah. Is this on? I have to hit a button.
Turn it up, yeah.
Aha, okay. First of all, hello, appreciate being here today. I also need to say that anything I say is my own opinion and not necessarily those of the U.S. government, Department of Defense, or U.S. Army.
But I also have to thank you for your service.
Yes. Thanks for support. Yes, I think what we saw in July, mainly at the end of August and going forward, is the power of social media and digital communication technologies to really change how we being the collective like human race can shape events around the world. Political science literature suggests kind of three things that are benefits from these kind of social media type technologies. And from seeing how the end of August went, those three things are absolutely benefits. The first one is the low cost. Social tech majorly reduces the cost of mobilizing. You don't have to do flyers, you don't have to try to build momentum and try to get everyone on board knowing that a thing is happening. Everyone knew that Afghanistan was falling at the end of August. Part two is you're able to connect people from geographically disparate locations all in support of the same cause, and that's absolutely true. Like I was talking with Luca, I didn't meet Luca until today. He was all over the globe, and I was in Arizona. I was working with people in California, and we were talking with people in Afghanistan. There are people all around the world working on this. And there's absolutely no way we could have pooled resources like we did without things like WhatsApp and Signal and Facebook. And the last piece is the social media helped give us direction. So often it seemed like for many of us, it usually was an Afghan we knew or an Afghan family we knew would reach out and say, hey, we need help. And I'm a political science student, so I have no idea how to help. But I knew there was a WhatsApp group I could hop into. I knew there was a whatever group I could hop into. And in those groups, I saw a bunch of other people working and starting to make progress. And that gave me a start point to figure out what I could do as well. And that just maintained momentum as various other people with resources would hop in, and you found all these different directions you could traverse or try to link up other people's cases with those resources. They hadn't discovered those resources yet. And that simply would have been possible probably 15 years ago. As far as the weaknesses, I guess, probably 3 there too. The first one was the question of trust. Because initially the movement gained a lot of momentum. We all were excited to actually be able to help some of our friends. But then the networks got larger, which was a plus because there was more resources, but also that meant I was more degrees removed from everyone I was working with. I did not know who I was working with to a certain extent. So then we had to figure out, okay, how do we build that trust? How do we build credibility? And it was a little easier for me because I have an official government email, so people could just email me and establish that I at least wasn't a Taliban person. But other people who didn't have that source of credibility, it was harder to establish who they actually were and what their play was in this. Part 2 is probably more an ethical one, the question of moral hazard, where one side of this equation, the people in the WhatsApp groups, were very much advising the people on the ground to take risks, while we in the WhatsApp groups or Signal groups or whatever, we were not running any of the risks ourselves. And sometimes the people on the ground had information we did not have access to. Actually, that was true in nearly all cases. So sometimes it would be tempting to advise people to take risks they weren't comfortable with, and we probably didn't have the authority to be making those recommendations because they had better information than we did. But because we had been helping them, like we were able to link them up with various resources, we perhaps had an aura of authority or power that probably shouldn't have been applied to those kind of questions they're asking for help with. So kind of the, I guess, appetite suppressant, like recognizing our limits. And then the third piece probably is sustainability, because the cost of entry is so low, it's easy to hop in, but the work is very absorbing. And it was, because I'm a grad student, I could just sit in front of a computer all day, no problem. But other, like folks who have more traditional responsibilities and jobs, and I'm single, and people who have families and kids to raise and that kind of stuff. The question is, how do you maintain this long term, given everyone can be connected now? Building some sort of rhythm so that you are not on all the time. With the mental health friction that can come with it, where you're moving from a life and death situation into Signal and trying to talk to someone who's very, very desperate, and then you're going to your nephew's 1-year-old birthday party the next hour. It's very, very tonally dissonant. It's recognizing the mental health things that come with that. And I'll hand it over to Luca.
Yeah, I'm going to try and connect with some of the points you mentioned, because at the end of the day, I think like MJ and I we had very similar experiences from slightly different angles. Didn't have a US government email to establish credibility, but for example, in my case, it often happened with, like, you get introduced into a new WhatsApp chat, into a new Signal chat, and then you jump on a call for like 1 or 2 minutes with somebody. You have a brief like exchange of like, oh, I'm this person, I'm doing this, and they're saying, oh, they're doing this, and you Google them, you do LinkedIn, you do Twitter, and you're figuring like, okay, probably this is somebody we can work with. But still an imperfect solution to the trust and security issues, so that's definitely something. Also, in terms of the collaboration, maybe just as a bigger point, one thing I also want to highlight, I think there's been a lot of conversation about like the US-based, the Europe-based, grassroots mobilization efforts. But at the end of the day, without like very courageous Afghans on the ground who were coordinating things, fixing things, taking the real risk, because like, I mean, we were in a very comfortable situation where, except for moral hazard situations and difficult decisions perhaps, like there weren't any actual risk to our lives. But for those folks, who were helping move people on the ground, there was a very different situation, and I don't think they've gotten quite enough credit as like media coverage has focused on Task Force Pineapple or other groups and civil society groups. In Germany, it's Kabel-Luftbrücke, for example, where I'm from. So for me, these are also the people who are really at the forefront of the grassroots efforts when it comes to that, right? I think one of the, now I'm actually going to answer your question. In terms of the benefits and I think opportunities, it was really this collaboration and mobilization that I think was mentioned from everybody who's speaking so far, that was on a level that I think I haven't quite seen ever before. Like, I mean, for like 10 years now, I've worked in the non-profit sector. We always try to mobilize people. We always try to build communities together. And here was this moment where I had to sort of post something on an Instagram story and say, I need to contact to the French government, because we had like some folks who previously worked for French NGOs in Afghanistan. And all of a sudden my inbox would be full of story reshares and people messaging me to a point where it was like, it was an information overflow. And this is one of the challenges, coordination and kind of like organization of information. But it was incredible to see so many different people coming together from so many different sectors. I mean, humanitarian activists and, for example, military are not always very good at working with each other. There's always some kind of like, I don't know, like suspicion or like discomfort on both sides at times. But all of a sudden it became a very natural collaboration where a lot of like information and cooperation was flowing. The same with private sector, with, I mean, Roya mentioned, you know, like private individuals, high net worth individuals, philanthropists. Sophia mentioned like Google engineers and so on. Folks who at times are difficult also to mobilize for something like this, right? And it was massive. So this was like one big benefit. I think one thing also which was crucial was that it was a very single issue kind of focused effort that helped it easy to mobilize and to coordinate. Like at that point it was really like, you know, we gotta get people out, and that's what it was all about. And it was the failure of the government. Like I think at the end of the day it was still an imperfect effort, and this is where we come to the challenges, but it was induced by the fact that governments all across the globe didn't step up to the task. I mean, my own effort started with me being on holiday and getting a call from a German Afghan friend saying like, you know, like we need to get people out and what can you do? And I was like, you know, let me call the people in the German foreign ministry that I know and that I've worked with in the past, and that proved very useless. And so clearly, you know, something, and this is where the networks were formed, where I got on a call with Dan, where Dan then later on got on calls with Anya and with Autumn. Also want to give credit for like being like amazing in organizing everything, and so that mobilization that was incredible. I think the challenges were the and this maybe touches a bit in the moral hazard of imperfect resource allocation, because you have so many different groups that mobilized at the same time. There were a lot of duplication of efforts. There were a lot of you know, resources that, if better coordinated, probably could have spent more effectively and more successfully, and also a kind of like clogging of the system, because one family or one group in Afghanistan was in parallel being helped by 5 different groups across the globe. And I think from a technology perspective, that's something that's probably solvable, but very difficult to solve, but which is interesting. I think this is something that has to be thought about and taken away from this experience, because there will be another experience like this or similar. And if there's a system in place, if there are mechanics and experiences in place where this kind of flow of information, coordination, trust and security vetting can be facilitated and organized, that would be an incredible, powerful tool to have.
In this instance, we're talking about the clock was ticking, right? You have certain amount of time to get people out. How do you motivate citizens, entrepreneurs, and innovators when the clock is not ticking?
Because a lot of nonprofits rely on an army of volunteers to help them. And this is something I experienced at Girls in Tech. We had presence in 6 continents, over 60 locations, which meant we had, we were working with women in rural India, we were working with women in Taiwan. But the thing is, most of the teams on the ground were volunteers. So I think that passion can turn into burnout, and that's the most dreadful thing that could happen, because I think that the people that are willing to spend every minute of their spare time towards a good cause should be really well resourced so they can continue doing that. Whether it's training, whether it's facilities, whether it's benefits, anything that can help make it easier for them to continue being at the forefront. I think that I take a lot of inspiration for how startups operate, because that's the ecosystem I'm in. So when you look at a startup, there's two things that happen with both the investors and the employees. There's really getting them engaged, and one way that they do that is by sending updates. So you have your regular quarterly investor note that you send out saying, this is what we've done, this is the progress that we've made, and I think that that keeps them engaged. I think with part of the challenge with relating that kind of to how nonprofits work is you have so many donors that are interested in various different levels. You have people who'll give you $25 a month, all the way to people who'll give you $100,000. So, you know, how do you keep those folks engaged? I think that, you know, ensuring that those people are treated like investors is an approach that I think has worked for the organizations I've worked in, and what we're looking to implement with Afghan Innovation. I think it's really important to continue to show that we're being effective, to continue to show that there's impact, and to show that you can actually break down a complex problem into smaller chunks. I think when you talk about the crisis in Afghanistan, or any crisis, whether it's climate related or war related, it feels so insurmountable. And I think it's really important to focus on smaller areas and really show that you've actually made progress. I think that's something that startups do really well and nonprofits struggle to do despite their really powerful mission statement. I think in terms of getting volunteers engaged, everyone operates really well when there's pressure. But once that pressure is off, when you try to apply pressure to burnt out volunteers, and this is something we experienced, those 2 weeks when the US was pulling out were the most insane. We had people, including myself, going to bed at 6:30 a.m. and waking up at 9 a.m. and working San Francisco time all the way to Kabul time. So that's, you know, it takes an enormous toll emotionally. You're dealing with people who are in crisis. We had people who were in serious danger and had incredible health conditions that we had to deal with. And we were making complex decisions, as Luca mentioned. You're put in this situation where you have to make decisions very, very quickly, and you don't have perfect information, and you're dealing with real people's lives, and you are the only source of hope that they have at that point. I think once you move out of crisis, two things happen. People have this exhaustion that they have to recover from, which most people don't because they have day jobs and they have lives to live. And I think that's where you have the massive plateau. People drop off. Getting people engaged is an art and a science. I think that some of the things that we would like to implement is providing clear goals and clear roles. I think that's really important. With volunteers, you have to be really exact about what tasks need to be carried out because they only have a certain amount of time. If you give responsibilities that a product manager should be doing, you're going to inundate that volunteer and you're not going to produce any results. So I think it's, with volunteers, my philosophy is some people are best at crisis mode volunteering, and there are other people who can be more sustainably working on projects on a longer term basis, and you have to identify who those people are, what their strengths are, and really work with those strengths, but then also figure out what they care about and allow them to take that on and really spearhead those initiatives. So I think those are the two key important areas that I've learned in the startup world, which I think should be applied to the nonprofit world, because I think nonprofits have the most powerful mission statements. Like you look at Google, yes, advertising is great, getting connected is great, but the mission statements that nonprofits have, you know, solving world hunger, solving climate change, like, you know, these are powerful, powerful problems. And I think it's really important to have as much resources, innovation, and people to put their love and attention into that area. And you can only do it by somehow figuring out how to make it sustainable and work for people's day-to-day lives.
I remember the time that we couldn't sleep enough. You know, we all, like, sometimes because you receive a lot of calls and you get frustrated. But when I saw all my American friends that they left their day jobs and they put in their times, even the time that I didn't have enough sleep, then I look at them and I see that they also didn't have enough sleep, but still they are working all those formats and all those Excel sheets. And they do it very calm, you know. And this actually motivated us to keep continuing. Actually, I'm inspired by the team of the people who I'm working with them. And I'm really proud to be part of those teams. And every day I get more motivated to keep continue this work to helping the people to get in the safety. They are still 3 months past, and they are working, and I'm just amazed with them. So thanks to them. And I just want to mention one thing else, that terrorism and extremists are like diseases, and they are a cancer that caused by the lack of economical opportunities, poor education, and you know, poverty. And but it can be prevented if we underline these factors. If we making sure that advancement of well-being of citizens and their safety, maybe we can help that to prevent it of the radicalizing of the people. And these people who are coming out, they're not only refugees, they are journalists, they are women activists, they are the professors at universities or engineers, or they are all have had the base hope of our nations. It's very sad to see all these people are sent into exile. You know, we have working with all of these people, and I'm working with them. We have been working so hard to make Afghanistan to be different. It's not that we're all gonna leave, but it doesn't mean that we're gonna give up. I just want to say that all people are not only fleeing from persecution or because of poverty or starvation. They have had jobs in their countries, and they had hope for their countries. It's just the situation has changed.
Thank you. We have an audience, we have technologists, we have engineers, entrepreneurs. What do you see as the role of engineering and also higher education to be in humanitarian response? Any of you who would like to respond?
Engineering has an enormous role in innovation, and I'd like to just share a personal story. So when we were in Pakistan, stuck in one of the camps, my father was an engineer, and so, you know, when you're in these camps, you are kind of stripped away from your identity, and people don't look at you as someone who has skills or resources. So this aid model is really fundamentally broken, and people are looking at you as like you needing help rather than what skills and abilities do you have that we can empower. So my dad, being the resourceful engineer that he was, created his own little workshop, or he would call it warak shop. Like, you know, he created his own little workshop, and he brought in all the boys in the camp and some girls, and he would just make them fix broken radios, broken TVs, like whatever that needed fixing, he would fix. But he would get all the kids and focus their mind and attention on something positive. Because I kid you not, in those camps, there were two things that were told to children. If you're female and you're fair-skinned, you're going to get kidnapped. If you're a boy, don't play around outside by yourself because you're going to get kidnapped by the Taliban and get trained as a child soldier. Now that's terrifying for a child to hear. Like in America, you have the boogeyman under your bed, but that's, you know, you can't compare it to real life Taliban out there. And what my dad did is he brought these kids in and taught them something really valuable. A lot of those kids never really had formal education. So some of them are 12, some of them are 15. They kind of missed that high school period where they couldn't apply to university. Some of them felt embarrassed to try and apply to university after that. But 30 years on, they're mechanics, they're engineers, software engineers, they're electrical engineers, not because they went to university, but because they were trained by my dad. So I think education is really important. And I think had my father not gotten that education, he would have not had that level of impact on those children's lives. And I think it's equally important for women. And I think, you know, again, I'm going to use my own family's example. My mother was one of the few family members in our family who went to universities. She studied economics. And when we finally escaped to England, we had a very serious health crisis. And my mother became the leading person who had to work. So she's in a position as a woman in her 20s with 3 children in a foreign country where she has to work 60-hour weeks, feed 3 children, take care of her family, and she did it with grace, and she did it with conviction, and she did it with confidence, and that confidence came from education. And because of her and my father, all 3 of us have gone through higher education. I wouldn't be in America here if it wasn't for them. So I think that the intergenerational power and impact that education has is really extraordinary. And I think that, you know, a lot of these kids who are currently in refugee camps, there's a lot of organizations who are looking to design for them rather than with them. And I think it's really important to include them. Education doesn't have to be formal. And I think that, you know, information and technology allows people to have access to education through YouTube, through Udemy. There are so many different formats of education, and I think that with formal education, it can actually restrict people who are in these liminal refugee situations. And I can attest to that personally, because when I got to England, I was 8.5. I had, most kids by then could read and write, could speak fluently in English, and I couldn't do any of that stuff. And so it became really difficult for me, and I felt deeply embarrassed about not being able to communicate, not being able to read or write. And I think that, you know, there's kids who are 15, 16, where they're not going to go to university. For one reason or another, they have to become family providers. And so I think that what's really exciting about this time is education can exist in so many formats. There are universities who do online educational programs, which means that those kids in refugee camps with an iPad can access something from USC. And I think that that's really just, to me, just really exciting.
I think that there is the things that this university can do is helping us with educating online. Still, we can provide training for educating young girls in countries like Afghanistan, so that they can pursue the dreams that they want to be one day becoming the next engineer or designer. I think that connectivity gives us this opportunity. It doesn't matter that if you be in the United States or be in Afghanistan, but if you have access to quality of education and connectivity, then we can make it change. And we have this exhibition, which we're going to build these robots, and we needed technical people so that they can support our team in the ground in Afghanistan and also in Qatar to design their robots so that they can showcase off to extremists and telling them that what a girl could be capable of doing that. If a girl under 20 can build the ventilators to save lives, if the girls can build the drones to help the farmers, how Taliban can deny education for the girls.
Yes, yes.
Oh, wow.
Kind of picking up from the broken humanitarian model as it is, and where it fails in acute crisis situation that we have now, but also in the more long-term perspectives of, you know, kind of what happened in Afghanistan in the last, you know, 15, 20 years, what happened in Somalia, and in other areas is that there's a fundamental disbalance of where resources go and how they are applied, and that's that roughly 4.7% of global humanitarian funding goes to local organizations. 4.57%. That's nothing in the grand scheme of things. And as we see now in the crisis situation, but also when we're looking at Somalia and Afghanistan over the last 20 years, the majority of the burden of the risk of the work that's being done is done by local frontline organizations. So if only a fraction of the funding goes to it, but they do the majority of the work, take the majority of the risk, like how they're going to succeed. We're putting them into a situation to fail. So I think what Sophia described, what Roya described, shows the solution of what could be there if the resources really were there in place to scale it. We would be talking about fundamentally different situations. So that conversation sadly is a very old one, right? Like, so the localization agenda, the Grand New Bargain has been a conversation that's been going on for 10, 15 years. I think 2 weeks ago, 1 week ago, USAID Administrator Powell made a speech, said that in the next decade she wants to take the current 6%, I think it is, of local funding that goes funding that goes to local organizations to 25%. But again, these speeches have been heard before, and it's kind of the pressure as a community, as solutions provider, that we need to keep up, that this is actually followed through, also on a global level, on a US level, everywhere. And part of that is showing the solution, putting the community and putting the media and putting the pressure behind the solution that actually funding shifts there. I think the other challenge is that a lot of the structures that are in place are still, of course, very sort of north-south driven. And also, if we look at collaboration, I mean, I know from Danny and from Professor Burchin that with the minor, with the classes, you've done a fantastic effort actually in partnering with local organizations. But even individual donors, whether that's like small donors, $10, $15, or big donors, and that's something that we also saw again in the crisis. I think, Sophia and I, we had a lot of conversations about it. There's this belief that if you give money to the bigger organizations, bigger things happen. So I think it's also a conversation that, yes, governments need to shift how resources are spent, but as individuals, persons, whether we are volunteering or donating or partnering as a university class with organizations, there's like a lot of power that can be shifted by going to the small organizations, going to the local organizations and supporting them. So I think like that's, from a policy side, something that really, would have so many like trickle-down consequences. Also how things shift from crisis response to crisis prevention, which is again like a never-ending conversation that's been around, and where the follow-through has continuously missed. How do we achieve that? I think it's again showing solutions, mobilizing community, and to answer the earlier question about like what can engineers do, I think from my own experience of working both in like recovery, rehabilitation of both juvenile offenders, but also former extremists, children associated with armed forces of group, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, there have always been two things like that have been very critical in recovery, reintegration, peace building, peace prevention, conflict prevention efforts. Sorry, not peace prevention, peace building efforts. That's the jet lag speaking now. And that's sports that connects, that builds community between people that don't trust each other, that don't know each other. And it's been, and I mean, Sophia gave a wonderful example of that, it's been the hope for livelihood. And Roya mentioned it earlier as well, like, so what prevents this cancer, right, of violent extremism? It's livelihoods, it's training, it's education. I think if stakeholders come differently together, that's really a solvable problem. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. From there, I want to ask, what are some of the other areas these grassroots efforts can help? There's food, health, mental health, we discussed security. So where do you see some of the needs where similar efforts could be observed?
Yeah, something that immediately comes to mind probably or any form of natural disaster. Is already discussed how when there's pressure of time, people are they're much easier to join the cause, but also too there's much more visibility, so people actually know something's going on that they can help with. So those kind of scenarios, whether it's like a hurricane down in the Gulf in the U.S. or it's a tsunami out in the Pacific, I think that's another scenario we can start to see grassroots efforts be of major help to other people.
I would say another area would be finance. So one of the interesting challenges that both Roya and I and many others here had was the groups that were evacuated. And I'll give an example again. We had a young female journalist who is currently in Pakistan, and she cannot access the ATM machine with her Afghan bank account. The main way of sending money to Pakistan was blocked because you just couldn't send money directly. We managed to get the hotel to accept our payment, so we covered her hotel cost and also asked that they cover 3 meals a day because there's no way we could physically send money to her. So I think that another area that grassroots could impact is having local organizations. There's other ideas like using blockchain, digital currencies, but I think a more immediate way is building networks of organizations locally that create hubs that can give access to capital to those that are in these limbo situations. I think that if you're out of status and you don't have a visa and you don't have legal status in a country, it's all those things that seem so easy for you and I become exponentially harder for them. And I think access to money is autonomy, it's freedom, it's power. And when you take that away from anyone, it's really crippling. And for us, it was deeply frustrating that we couldn't send money to her just so she could, I don't know, maybe she wanted to go see a friend, or maybe she had a health emergency and she needed to go to the hospital. She was bound to what the hotel could cover. And that's really frightening. So I think that mobilizing grassroots organizations, small NGOs that could provide immediate support, financial support, is critical.
I just want to add, I think that the finance issue is one big point. I think another pain point that we are facing right now, which I think is universal sort of to how evacuations efforts are continuing, is the fading media and press attention, and with that the fading political pressure. So if we're speaking about like grassroots organizing, I think something also that everybody I think in this room just through the power of their voice can contribute to is putting pressure politically. I think like in different capacities, you're not, because you're not allowed to, but I know like Roya, Sophia and I, we're all in different capacities involved in mobilizing pressure on the US government and on other governments to change the way how the visa system is currently working, because it's a system that's designed to fail. It's intended to fail in many ways. It's not meant to be worked when you have a backlog of 20,000 applications, when you speak to people who applied for the visas, whether that's SIV in the US or the equivalent in Germany. They applied for it in 2019 and they haven't received an interview at the embassy yet. And now all of a sudden it's the answer like, well, we don't have the biometrics, we can't do an interview. Well, you had 2 years time to get an interview done. So clearly, like, and now with the pressure fading, we notice, people have less time for the issue, and this is something that I think everybody in this room can contribute to keeping that alive. And I think also, maybe more speaking internally as a university, we have a lot of folks who have arrived now and who were also, again, a second sort of grassroots organizing, and maybe a different type of grassroots organizing is needed to help the many people who have arrived now to settle into their lives here. And I know there have been a lot of efforts, But one big topic, for example, we're also discussing is access to education, whether that's for folks who had to had their education now disrupted in Afghanistan who are coming here. And there are different initiatives. I'm not quite sure maybe whether something like this already exists at USC from US and other universities to set up specific dedicated scholarships for Afghan scholars, whether that's a fellowship for like a PhD level at different faculties, or a scholarship for masters, for undergrad studies. And I think like as a student or as faculty to ask for something like this, to suggest something like this, to mobilize the student community, the faculty community, and push for this collectively can also have a very big impact now on the people who are here and who are starting into new chapters of their lives.
Luca and MJ, you talked and touched on sort of decentralization versus centralization of nonprofits and efficiencies and inefficiencies there. So we've got 3 years and on our fourth cohort of teams, students that have been building projects, building nonprofits, and the ones that continue beyond, that go for years, I see a struggle, and that struggle, which all of you have touched on, is a connection with finance and resonance. Like, how can they sustain themselves? The sustainability of their missions, especially when so many of them, at their scale, are making such a significant impact. And I'm curious what you guys think, especially in what you guys just experienced. I'm sure you saw some groups that maybe didn't get far, and others that clearly resonated and maybe rallied more people. And storytelling is a big part of our course as well, but I'm curious, from your perspectives, what made certain groups resonate and sort of, get in that virtuous cycle of growth and impact? Because I think that's what we need, or our students.
This is something that I actually think about a lot. And when I first moved to the US, I worked at this organization and I came in as an intern. Within a year, they asked me to be COO of the organization. And part of that was, and this is probably what happens in America all the time, part of that was that I started questioning, why does a nonprofit operate the way it does? Why is it limited when it has such an important mission? And part of it is that nonprofits' business model is to be, giving support or aid, and it doesn't necessarily have a business model that keeps it sustainable. So its business model is to go out and do campaigns, raise donations, and that's its business model. That does not work, and it does not create scalable impact. So, the organizations hit this barrier. So the organization I was working in was operating for 9 years, I believe, before I worked there, and it was relying on this constant, skipping rope of events to create awareness, to raise funds, to do galas and conferences. And so much of the team's mental energy went into doing that just so they could raise funds. That the impact on the actual programs and its mission statement were lagging. So when I joined the organization, I was like, what can we do that will allow us to have sustainable revenue that's separate, regardless of whether this year this organization is on the news or not, or the topic is popular or not? What can we do that we have, so that we have our own business model, that we're not reliant on, donations, every year? And what we did was we built strategic partnerships with key organizations that had interest in areas that we were working with. So as I mentioned, we were, in 60 locations. There's emerging markets that large corporations are interested in, whether it's hiring diverse talent, whether it's becoming popular in those countries. And so we built multi-year strategic partnerships, and for the first time I was writing these proposals and just kind of flying by the seat of my pants, just like figuring it out to see what would stick. So instead of asking people, can you sponsor this event that we're doing, I would say, could you come in on a multi-year strategic $1 million partnership with us? This would entail, year 1, we would do this. Year 2, we would do this. With the idea that by the 5th year, we could produce a white paper that can show that the funds that you've invested have had actual impact, which is kind of uncommon. So that's what we did there. And this is something that I'm figuring out with Afghan Innovation. It's an organization that's now 2.5 months old. And we're trying to figure out what is the business model, what is the key pain point that we're focusing on. Because beyond the crisis mode, the work that we need to do is going to be long term. And we have to find a business model that will allow us to almost run like a startup but in a non-profit format. And so I hope that sharing that example was an idea of how we shifted the model from donation to a startup model, like, you know, making nonprofits. I think the new era is making nonprofits run like a startup. And I know that B Corps have become that, you know, where it's like, you know, you're a business but you have a social impact. But I actually think nonprofits have a really important role, and it's more about figuring out how to remove the noise and the distraction, which is these constant events, constant campaigns and fundraising, and really focusing on building a very strong, simple business model. And what I noticed, the organizations throughout this time frame that had, you know, momentum and continued momentum had clarity. And the organizations that didn't were the ones that were trying to do a million things all at once. And, you know, at the very, you know, in the height of things, everyone was trying to do everything. And I think for us, you know, Dan, Luca, we're trying to figure out, as we move forward, how do we begin to refine and get closer and closer to the area that we can be most effective with the skill sets that we have. So that's it.
Hi, I'm Amber. I actually used to work on the, hi Sophia. I used to work on the, for the State Department as a diplomat on our Afghan Special Immigrant Visas unit. So I know the calamity that ensues when you try to get people to qualify for the P1 and the P2 visas. My question is to you, for the entire panel actually, and specifically MJ with DOD. I think a lot of parts, there's a lot of innovations that can be done within the humanitarian and nonprofit realms. But at the end of the day, the people who stamp the visas, the people who open their gates, the people who allow any movement that necessarily needs to happen in the humanitarian crisis are, I don't want to use the B word, but bureaucrats. The bureaucracy makes things function at the end of the day. Our joke at the State Department used to be using yesterday's technology tomorrow. We were like uploading maybe Windows version 7 like last year. And so a lot of the handicaps have to do with the fact that and I don't know about Germany, I pray that you all are better, but a lot of the handicaps have to do with the fact that the technology doesn't exist from partners. You can't vet people quickly, fingerprints, names, dates of birth, the Tazkiras, if they mistype a name based on the local dialect, somebody is stuck in a refugee camp for 8 years because they can't tell the difference between this guy who's normal, who's a well-adapted citizen, and some guy who has the same name, or 200 other guys that have the same name that might have been blacklisted or affiliated in some way with the Taliban. So these were some of the challenges that we faced. And I'm wondering, I know that the government isn't always a great tech partner, but if any of you have thought about approaching the government and setting up some type of collaboration to bring some of those innovations to governments. Because at the end of the day, nonprofits can do so much, and innovators and humanitarians can do so much, but if the government's not willing to move or able to move, a lot of crucial missions get stuck.
I was on the outside of DoD's efforts for this. I was just a private citizen in a bunch of chat rooms. I know, I hypothesize based on just the experience of being around the Army. it's the slowness of the acquisitions process, like you described. The acquisitions process is just how we get new tech. Like it's got to be vetted with so many like contractors, and they all have to bid, and they have to pick the best one, and then it's got to be through a 5 to 10, like a very long production process, and then it's actually implemented, and then eventually beta tested, and so forth and so on. That's just like my rough understanding of the process. I don't really know what it is, but it takes a long time. And then within that, there are increased security concerns. I think that may be part of the slowness and the response there. I'm a junior level person, so I don't have the best situational awareness on some of the hitches there, but I agree that it seems often that using social media that other people can respond quicker or faster.
If the political willingness would be there, these partnerships that you're mentioning and these efforts, like this acceleration of efforts, would be happening. I think in many ways, also, you know, if I look at Europe and, you know, what happened since the peak of the refugee numbers arriving in Europe in 2015, there's an awareness that this problem exists. And the same with Afghanistan. There was an awareness, speaking like I can most intimately speak of European governments again, there was an awareness that a backlog of application existed, that the security situation was escalating. Maybe it escalated, you know, a few months quicker than analysts predicted, but there was an awareness that this issue would be there. And until July, until June, there was not the political desire to change that, to fix the system, because there was a political calculation that taking in a large number of asylum seekers, refugees, would come at a higher political cost than risking some form of, you know, humanitarian crisis in faraway Afghanistan. And that political calculation changed in July and in August, when dramatic pictures and a lot of media coverage started emerging and started creating a lot of pressure and momentum. Yep. And then suddenly we arrived at the flip side of a previously very, you know, cautious and security-driven process where over, you know, as I said, people applied for visas in 2019, and this is not an exception. Like there were a lot of cases, a lot of folks, you know, who applied, filed their paperwork in 2019, and I think it's right that security has to drive this process and that there have to be precautions. But suddenly in July and August, we were then completely flipping it and having people put on planes, people being, you know, flown into countries without almost any security check at all, because the political calculation had changed. And then, you know, folks who actually create, like, you know, I mean, specifically of Germany, I'm aware of a number of cases where ex-Taliban, very senior folks, you know, somehow made it to Germany. And other folks, you know, that were trying to help in Kabul and Herat and Kandahar still, you know, are there who should be in Germany and they're not. And I think so, it brings me back to a mobilization point of, like, you know, where a lot has to do with political pressure and the political willingness. And I think, I mean, we're speaking to a lot of senators and Congress people and you know, German parliament members. They all were very frustrated at times because they were dealing with the same issues in the same system. And when, you know, a lot of people want to make something happen, but and you know, supposedly these are the folks who should be able to, but it's not, then you have an issue that goes beyond, I think, technology and innovation. I think, like, yeah, maybe again a bit controversial, but I think innovation is super important, but it's not the be all and end all. Like, you know, some problems are not going to be solved by innovation. Some problems have to be solved through community and through political will, and through a change of the cultural norms that we are establishing.
I think that innovation can be hugely disruptive, so I'm going to somewhat disagree with Luca here.
I fully agree with that.
And I think that, you know, because of the access to social media, you know, even the government can't get away with, you know, bad behavior or, you know, misconduct. So I think it's really, we're living in a really interesting time, and I think that I look at the work that SpaceX did. You know, 10 years ago, NASA was the main funded organization by the government. Billions of dollars went into NASA. Elon Musk came in and said, we could probably do this better and faster. And 10 years on, not only are they working with NASA, but they also just received their first large government contract. I think it was like $5-something billion. I think that's a really good example. Now, that's, it has similar challenges in the sense that space and government are connected, and there's a lot of bureaucracy in that space too. Maybe not as much as the humanitarian aid space, but I think that, there's so much opportunity in the humanitarian aid space, and I think if we can create excitement and opportunity and galvanize people and get people here and students here to say, yes, I want to solve this problem, and I can do it better, more efficiently, more cost efficiently, and we can publish that we can get people resettled and reintegrated within 2 years rather than 20 years. Governments will have to look at that. The UN will have to respond to that. And so I think that's where change can really be made. I think that one of the things I'm learning is we're doing some advocacy work. We're speaking to governments, we're talking to experts about how we can change legislation, how we can influence that. And that's a long-term roadmap. You have to build these relationships and everything strategically timed. And there are people who are phenomenal at that. That's what they do for their bread and butter. And I think that, playing into the bureaucracy leads to inefficiency and delay, because once you're in the network, then you're no longer thinking outside of the box. And you think that you have to please this senator and this congressman to get a yes, when actually all you really need to do is do the work, and that will show the results. Now, applying that to this complex ecosystem is easier said than done, and we know getting the US to process humanitarian parole applications faster, getting them to start taking in people from Albania and Ecuador and various other countries that Afghans are currently displaced in, that's all political. And one of the things that recently happened, which is unfortunate, which has actually put a huge wrench into the civilian-led evacuation, is a week ago, teams could work with the government and get people evacuated to that country for a short period of time. 3 months all the way to 2 years. Now the State Department has gotten involved and said no country can allow people to evacuate to their country without our approval, which automatically shuts down the evacuation efforts led by civilians. I think that that's an area that I'd love to get you guys excited about. I think it's something that shouldn't be allowed. America shouldn't have that kind of power over people's lives. Other governments should have autonomy around who they want to help. And I think that really prevents people like Luca and myself and everyone here to do the work that we really want to do. It's already challenging to do that, being resource kind of limited, let alone having the entire US government decide that they're going to slow down the entire evacuation process. Now, there's obviously a reason why they're doing that, because they don't want to deal with more people coming in. But I think that there is appetite from other countries. And I think the other piece to it that I think is really important is really changing the narrative around refugees. I think, Amber, that's one of the most powerful ways to impact the bureaucratic system. When you look at people coming into your country as dependent, as helpless, as resource vampires, no one wants to fast track those application processes. So I think flipping the head and looking at refugees as economic drivers is the only way you can make that happen. When I came to England, I came as a refugee. When I came to America, I came on the weird Einstein visa that they have. And my visa was fast-tracked. Within 3 days, I got the visa, which is crazy. And that's like just 10 years apart from getting into England to getting into America. And so I think if we can change that narrative and get people to look at this group of people, whether it's even changing the name of refugees, like why are they called refugees? Beyond the immediate refuge, they are people now who are new settlers in a country. They should no longer be looked down upon or looked at as helpless. And I think that it's a small thing, but that change in language has enormous power in how people respond and treat a whole group of people who are displaced. I think that that could also help fast track visa processing, because it doesn't make sense that people that come from all over the world can get to Silicon Valley, can get visas, can work at Google and Facebook and Apple, and yet these refugees who are equally as talented, who would be, you know, absolutely effective at whatever roles they were put in, have to wait 10 years in, you know, God knows where before they can actually, you know, have any legal status. So I think there's many different angles to this.
I'm from the CS department. I'm doing my PhD in there. So I have one very broad question. Like, if today you could get access to some crazy technology, it may exist today, may not exist today, but if you just could get that and you could solve some real world problem, what would it be?
One that immediately comes to mind is like the idea of like a universal translator, like kind of Star Trek-y. Like just the number of times that I was trying to talk to Afghans and they were trying to talk back to me through Google Translate, and we were totally talking past each other. Just a better way to understand. Because there have been times where I think the person I'm talking to is either very angry at me or very grateful to me, and I couldn't tell which one. There are only so many times you can say, I'm sorry, I don't understand what you're saying. And the relationship is kind of frayed.
I think that still there are billions of people that don't have access to connectivity. Mm-hmm. Yes. And the most important thing is that we're making sure those people have access to connectivity, quality of education, and then we can solve all the issues together. And there are still millions of girls cannot even go to the schools. One thing that the technology helped during this time is that I don't know how many of you are interested in cryptocurrency, but I think that Bitcoin solves a lot of issues right now in Afghanistan. And when all the banks is closed, as Sophia just mentioned, that we don't know how to send money to Afghanistan, we send money through Bitcoin. It's very easy. They can at least buy the fruits for themselves. And again, it's just proof that central banking are failing. And I don't know, maybe people maybe not agree with me, but it just shows that in the conflict area, when a government change overnight, then many people are gonna lose their access to the money. I give you one example is one of my friends. He was very wealthy, and I was all the time encouraging him to invest on Bitcoin. And he says, no, never. And he looks at like is skeptical, and this is like a fraud. If I don't touch some things, I don't believe on that. But when during the evacuation, he has to leave with one backpack, and he cannot have access to any of his wealth in Afghanistan. Not his farms, not houses, not armed cars, the money that he had in his bank. And then when he left it, the first thing that he told me that he did a mistake, that he didn't listen to me a month before.
A digital way to recognize and identify people. So one of the things that was really interesting, during this time, you're speaking to so many people that you don't recognize. And we were looking at, and I should probably not be saying this on camera, but we were talking to various groups who were ex-military and who were running operations. And we were doing due diligence to see, are these the types of people we should really be working with? And one of the things that became very clear is passports are an issue. They're physical, the Taliban can come to your house and, take them, identify you. And I think there's a way to have a digital ID card that can be used. And at some point we were considering working with an organization where we could use a digital form of identity instead of physical documentation so that they could get on this flight. And so I think that digital IDs are really important. They're already starting to happen with the iPhone face recognition. But I think that this is, a degree above that where governments will need to start having digital IDs. And I think this is really, really important for the 85 million plus people who are displaced around the world. I think that's really, really important. I think the other piece is talent and employment. As I mentioned, there's like over 80 million people who are displaced. That's 80 million people who are not taxpayers, 80 million people whose talent and potential is completely just left in no man's land. And I think that if we could use technology as a way to employ people that surpasses, tax and international laws and visa regulation, at least for the time being, whilst they are having their visas processed. Granted that it can take between 1 all the way to like 10 years for someone's visa to be processed. And so, those people, if there's a way that we could employ them, and if there's a way that we could do it in a way that doesn't break any international law or any individual government's tax laws, that would be pretty interesting. And I have some ideas, and I'd love to talk to you guys about ways that could happen.
Great. Well, I would like to thank all of you, Luca, MJ, Sophia, Roya, for everything you've done and everything you're doing, and also sharing some of your experience as well as some of the inspirational thoughts with us today. Thank you.